again, so I'm starting with Ralph here, looking at our characters here. So if we recall, so Ralph is one of the first two boys that we see. And so Ralph, we know that he's 12 years old. And he was excited that there are no adults around, right? He was excited at first to be strapped on this island. We know that his dad is in the Navy. So we know his dad is in the Navy. And so what ends up happening here is eventually he finds the shell, he blows it, and he gets elected as the chief. Can everyone see this? I can zoom in if not. So next we have Jack. Now Jack, if we recall, his name is also Merridew, Jack Merridew. So he was the leader of the choir, and the choir is a literal choir, the singing choir. We also know that he's tall, and he seems to be the oldest. So one thing is he seems very theatrical. He likes to make an impression, right? When the shell got blown, he walked in, his men were like in rank and file and like standing still. Like one of them literally passed out because he was so exhausted. He's a very theatrical person. He's theatrical and focuses on impressions. What does it look like? Next we have Piggy. So Piggy is, he's the fat boy, right? Fat boy, asthma, etc. All of Ralph's ideas at the very start, or sorry, all the things that Ralph got credit for at the start, Piggy was the one who did, right? So Piggy gave Ralph all the big ideas in chapter 1. He seems to be, he's made fun of by everyone so far. We won't go through a lot. We're going to have Simon here as well. So Simon was the boy who fainted from the choir. We're going to skip Roger. We're not going to touch Roger. And we're going to go to Sam and Eric. So Sam and Eric, ooh, what am I doing? They are twins and they are 6 years old. And that's all we need to know about them for now. Okay, and so we're gonna leave it there. Everyone's done writing? Okay, we're gonna leave it there. We did our plot summary here, but just a quick reminder already, when they woke up on the island, there's World War III going on. They talked about atom bombs. We find this conch shell. They use it to call the others. Ralph is voted chief. And also embarrasses not only Piggy, but Jack. They eventually do discover it's an island, right? They go on their, Simon, Jack, and Ralph go on a little journey. They go around the island. They eventually find a pig, and they, Jack tries to, wants to kill it, pauses, it gets away. He seems to be really embarrassed from it. We establish, Piggy seems to make good decisions. Jack leads the choir. And overall, the whole thing that they're in right now, the situation is not really be taken that seriously. So we're going to start reading here from where we left off, which is on chapter 2. Where did I put my book? Oh. Start reading here. So we are on page 30. You guys have that one. Okay. Page 42 if you're using the red book. So chapter 2, Fire on the Mountain. So by the time Ralph finished blowing the conch around, the platform was crowded. Actually, look at this. There was a difference between this meeting and the one held in the morning. The afternoon sun was slanted in from the other side of the platform, and most of the children, feeling too late, the smart of sunburn, had put their clothes on. The choir, noticeably less of a group, has discarded their cloaks. Ralph sat on the fallen trunk and his left side to the burn. On his right were most of the choir, and on his left were the larger boys who had known each other before the evacuation. Before him, small children had squatted on the glass in silence now. Ralph had lifted the cream and pink shell to his knees, and a sudden breeze scattered light over the platform. He was uncertain whether to stand up or to remain sitting. He looked sideways to his left, towards the bathing pool. Piggy was sitting there, but given no help. He looks to Piggy for help. And Ralph cleared his throat. Well then, all at once he found he could talk fluently and explain what he had to say. He passed a hand through his fair hair and spoke. We're on an island, and we've been on the mountaintop and seen water all around. We saw no houses, no smoke, no footprints, no boats, no people. We're on an uninhabited island with no other people on it. And Jack broke in. All the same, you need an army for hunting. Hunting pigs. Yes, there are pigs on the island. All three of them tried to convey the sense of the pink live thing struggling in the creepers. We saw squealing and it broke away before I could kill it, but next time. And Jack slammed his knife into a trunk and looked around challengingly. And the meeting settled down again. So you see, said Ralph, we need hunters to get us meat. And another thing. He looked at the shell on his knees and looked around the sun-slashed faces. There aren't any grown-ups. We shall have to look after ourselves. The meeting hummed and was silent. And another thing, we can't have everybody talking at once. We'll have to have a hands up like at school. He's trying to establish some order. He held the conch before his face and glanced around the mouth. Then I'll give him the conch. Conch, that's what this thing's called. I'll give the conch to the next person to speak. He can hold it when he's speaking. But look, and he won't be interrupted except by me. And Jack was on his feet.
We'll have rules, he cried excitedly. Lots of rules. And when anyone breaks them, Weo Wacko Bon Doink. Ralph had felt the conch lift from his laps. Then Piggy was standing, cradling the great cream shell, and shouting died down. Jack, left on his feet, looked uncertainly at Piggy, who smiled down and patted the fog. Jack had sat down. Piggy took off his glasses and blinking at the assembly when he wiped them on his shirt. You're hindering Ralph. You're not letting him get to the important thing. He paused effectively. Who knows we're here, eh? They knew at the airport, the man with the trumpet thing, my dad. Piggy had put on his glasses. Nobody knows where we are, said Piggy. He was paler than before and breathless. Perhaps they know where we are going to, or perhaps not, but they don't know where we are because we never got there. He gaped at them for a moment and then swayed and sat down. Ralph took the conch from his hands. That's what I was going to say, he went on. When you he gazed at their intent faces. The plane was shot down in flames, and nobody knows where we are. We may be here a long time. So Piggy's, seemed to be pretty logical and sensible. The silence was so complete that they could hear the fetch and the miss of Piggy's breathing. The sun slanted in and lay on golden over the platform, and the breezes on the lagoon that had chased their tails like kittens were finding their way across the platform and into the forest. Ralph had pushed back the tangle of fair hair that hung on his forehead. So we may be here a long time. Nobody said anything. He grinned suddenly, but this was a good island. We, Jack, Simon, and me, we climbed the mountain. It's wizard. There's food and drink and rocks, blue flowers. Piggy, partly recovered, pointed to the conch in Ralph's hands, and Jack and Simon fell silent. And Ralph went on. So he's trying to tell him, respect the law, respect the rules. While we're waiting, we can have a good time on this island. He gestured widely. It's like in a book. At once there was a clamor. Treasure Island, Swallows and Amazons, Coral Island, and Ralph waved the conch. This is our island, and it's a good island. Until the grown-ups come to fetch us, we'll have fun. And Jack held out his hand for the conch. There's pigs, he said. There's food and bathing water in that little stream along there, and everything. Didn't anyone find anything else? And he handed the conch back to Ralph and sat down. Apparently, no one had found anything. The other boys first noticed the child when he resisted. There was a group of little boys urging him forward, and he did not want to go. He was a shrimp of a boy, about 6 years old, and on one side of his face was a blotted out mulberry-colored birthmark, so a very purple birthmark on one side of his face. He stood now, worked out on the perpendicular by the fierce light of publicity, and he bored into the coarse grass with one toe. He was muttering and about to cry, and the other little boys, whispering but serious, pushed him towards Ralph. All right, said Ralph, come on then. And the small boy looked around in a panic. Speak up. The small boy held out his hands for the conch, and then the assembly shouted with laughter, and at once he snatched back his hands and started to cry. Let him have the conch, shouted Piggy. Let him have it. At last Ralph induced him to hold the shell, but by then the blowed laughter had taken away the child's voice. Piggy knelt by him, one hand on the great shell, listening and interpreting to the assembly. He wants to know what you're going to do about the snake thing. Ralph laughed, and the other boys laughed with him, and the small boy twisted further into himself. Tell us about the snake thing. Now he says it was a beastie. Beastie? A snake thing, ever so big. He saw it. Where? In the woods. Either the wandering breezes or perhaps the decline of the sun allowed a little coolness under the trees, and the boys felt it and stirred restlessly. You could have a bestie, a snake thing, on an island this size, Ralph explained kindly. You only get them in big countries like Africa or India. Murmur and the grave nodding of heads. He says the beastie came in the dark, then he couldn't see it, and laughter and cheers. Did you hear that? Says he saw the thing in the dark. He still says he saw the beastie. It came and went away again and came back to eat him. And he was dreaming, laughing. Ralph looked for the confirmation at the ring of the faces, and the older boys agreed. But here and there among the little ones, there was some dubity that required more than rational assurance. He must have had a nightmare, something about him on all those creepers. More grave nodding. They knew about nightmares. He says he saw the beastie, the snake thing, and will come back tonight. But there isn't a beastie. He says in the morning it turned them into things like ropes in the trees and hung the branches. He says it will come back tonight, but there isn't a beastie. And there was no laughter at all now, and more grave watching. Ralph pushed both hands through his hair and looked at the little boy in mixed amusement and exasperation. And Jack seized the conch. Ralph's right, of course. There isn't a snake thing, but if there was a snake, we'd hunt it and kill it. We're going to hunt pigs and get meat for everybody, and we'll look for the snake too. But there isn't a snake. We'll make sure when we go hunting. Ralph was annoyed and, for the moment, defeated. He felt himself facing something ungraspable. The eyes that looked so intently at him were without humor, but there isn't a beast. Something he had not known was there rose in him and compelled him to make the point loudly again. But I tell you, there isn't a beast. The assembly was silent, and Ralph lifted the conch again, and in good humor came back to as he thought to what he had to say next. Now we come to the important thing. I was thinking while we were climbing the mountain. He flashed a conspirational grin at the other two. And on the beach just now, this is what I thought. We want to have fun, and we want to be rescued. The passionate noise of agreement from the assembly hit him like a wave, and he lost his thread. He thought again. We want to be rescued, and of course we shall be rescued. And voices babbled. The simple statement, unbacked by any proof but the weight of Ralph's new authority, brought light and happiness. He had to wave the conch before he could make them hear him. My father's in the Navy, and he said there isn't any unknown islands left. He says the Queen has a big room full of maps, and all the islands in the world are drawn there. So the Queen's got a picture of this island. Again came the sounds of cheerfulness and a better heart. And sooner or later, a ship will put in here. It might even be Daddy's ship. So you see, sooner or later, we shall be rescued. And he paused. With the point made, the assembly was lifted back towards safety by his words. They liked and now respected him. Spontaneously, they began to clap, and presently the platform was loud with applause. Ralph flushed, looking sideways at Piggy's open admiration, and then the other way at Jack, who was smirking and showing that he too knew how to clap. Ralph waved the conch. Shut up, wait, listen. He went on in the silence, born in his triumph. There's another thing. We can help them to find us. If a ship comes near the island, they may not notice us. So we must make smoke on top of the mountain. We must make a fire. Make a fire. And at once the boys were on their feet, and Jack clambered among them, the conch forgotten. Come on, follow me. The space under the palm tree was full of noise and movement. Ralph was on his feet too, shouting for quiet, and nobody heard him. All at once, the crowd swayed towards the island and were gone, following Jack. Even the tiny children went and did their best among the leaves and the broken branches. Ralph was left, holding the conch, with no one but Piggy. Piggy's breathing was quite restored. Little kids, he said scornfully, acting like a crowd of little kids. And Ralph looked at him doubtfully and laid the conch on the tree trunk. I bet it's gone tea time, said Piggy. What do you think they're going to do on that mountain? He caressed the shell respectfully and then stopped and looked up. Ralph, hey, where are you going? Ralph was already clambering over the first smashed swakes of the scar. A long way ahead of him was crashing and laughter, and Piggy watched him in disgust, like a crowd of kids. He bent aside and laced up his shoes. The noise of the errant assembly faded up in the mountain, and then, with the martyred expression of a parent who has to keep up with the senseless ebullience of children, he picked up the conch, returned towards the forest, and began to pick his way over the tumbled scar. Below the other side of the mountaintop was a platform of forest, and once again Ralph found himself making the cupping gesture. Down there we could get as much wood as we wanted. Jack nodded and pulled at his underlip. Starting perhaps 100 feet below them on the steeper side of the mountain, the patch might have been designated expressly for fuel. Trees, forced by the damp heat, found too little soil for full growth, fell early and decayed, and the creepers cradled them with new saplings searching a way up. Jack had turned to the choir, who stood readily. Their black caps of maintenance were slid over one ear like berets. We built a pile, come on. They found the likeliest path down and began tugging at the dead wood. All the small boys who had reached the top came sliding too, till everyone but Piggy was busy. Most of the wood was so rotten that when they pulled it, it broke up into a shower of fragments and wood lice and decay. But some trunks came up in one piece. The twins, Sam and Eric, were the first to get a likely log, but could do nothing until Ralph, Jack, Simon, Roger, and Maurice had found the room for a handhold. Then they inched the grotesque dead thing up the rock and tumbled it over on top. Each party of boys added a quota, less or more, and the pile grew. At return, Ralph found himself alone on a limb with Jack, and they grinned at each other, sharing this burden. This burden is of their leadership, right? The burden is their leadership here. They're smiling at this burden. Both of them are leaders of their own right. Once more, amid the breeze, the shouting, the slanting sunlight of the high mountain. The shed that glamored, that strange visible light of friendship and adventure and content, almost too heavy. Jack grinned back, not for the two of us. So if they work together, they can do it. Together, joined in by the effort of the burden, they staggered up the last steps of the mountain, and together they chanted 1, 2, 3, and crashed the log onto the giant pile. And then they stepped back, laughing with triumphant pleasure, so that immediately Ralph had to stand on his head. Below them, the boys were still laboring, although some of the small ones had lost interest and were searching this new forest for fruit. Now the twins, with unsuspected intelligence, came up the mountain with armfuls of dried leaves and dumped them against the pile. One by one, as they sensed the pile was complete, and the boys stopped going back for more and stood with the pink shattered top of the mountain around them. Breath came even now, and the sweat dried. Ralph spoke first, crimson in the face. Will you? He cleared his throat and went on. Will you light the fire? Now the absurd situation was open, and Jack blushed too. He began to mutter vaguely. You rub 2 sticks, you rub. He glanced at Ralph, who blurted out the last confession of incompetence. Has anyone got matches? You can make a bow and spin the arrow, said Roger, and he rubbed his hands in mine. Bzz, bzz. So they can't start the fire, right? So they did all this work to light the fire, and they had no way to light it. A little air was moving over the mountain, and Piggy came back with it in shorts and shirt, laboring cautiously out of the forest with the evening sunlight gleaming from his glasses. He held the conch under his arm, and Ralph shouted at him, Piggy, have you got any matches? And the other boy took up the cry till the mountain rang. Piggy shook his head and came to the pile. Ma, you've made a big heap, haven't you? And Jack pointed suddenly. His specs, use them as burning glasses. And Piggy was surrounded before he could get away. Here, let go of me. His voice rose to a shriek of terror as Jack snatched the glasses off his face. Mind out, give him back. I can hardly see. You'll break the conch. And Ralph elbowed him to one side and knelt by the pile. Stand out of the light. There was pushing and pulling from the officious cries, and Ralph moved the lens back and forth, this way and that, till a glossy white image of the declining sun lay on a piece of rotten wood. And almost at once, a thin trickle of smoke rose up that made him cough. Jack knelt too and blew gently, so that the smoke drifted away, thickening, and a tiny flame reappeared. So again, they worked together and they got this flame going. The flame, nearly invisible at first in the bright sunlight, enveloped a small twig and grew and was enriched by color and reached up to a branch which exploded with a sharp crack. The flames flapped higher and higher, and the boys broke into a cheer. My specs, howled Piggy. Give me my specs. And Ralph stood away from the pile and put the glasses into Piggy's groping hands, and his voice subsided to a mother. Just blurs and all, that's it. Can hardly see my hand. And the boys were dancing. The pile was so rotten and now so tinder dry that whole limbs yielded passionately to the yellow flames that poured upwards and shook like a great beard of flame, 20 feet in the air. For yards round the fire, the heat was like a blow, and the breezes were a river of sparks. Trunks crumbled to white dust, and Ralph shouted, more wood, all of you, get more wood. Life became a race with the fire, and the boys scattered through the upper forest. To keep a clean plague of flame, trying on the mountain was the immediate end, and no one looked further. Even the smallest boys, unless fruit claimed them, brought little pieces of wood and threw them in. The air moved a little faster and became a light wind, so that leeward and windward side were clearly differentiated. On the other side of the air was a cool, but on the other side of the fire thrust out a savage arm of heat that crinkled hair on an instant. Boys who felt the evening wind on their damp faces paused to enjoy the freshness of it, and then found themselves were exhausted. They flung themselves down on the shadows that lay among the shattered rock, and the beard of the flame diminished quickly, and then the pile fell inwards with a soft cindery sound, and from the great tree of sparks upwards that leaned away and drifted downwards. And the boys lay panting like dogs, and Ralph raised his head off his forearms. That was no good, and Roger spat efficiently into the hot dust. What do you mean? There wasn't any smoke, only flame. And Piggy was settled himself in a coign between two rocks and sat with the conch on his knees. We haven't made a fire, he said. What's any use? We couldn't keep a fire like that going, not if we tried. A fat lot you tried, said Jack contemptuously. You just sat. We used his specs, said Simon, smearing a black cheek with his forearm. He helped that way. I got the conch, said Piggy indignantly. You just let me speak. The conch doesn't count on the top of the mountain, said Jack, so you shut up. I've got the conch in my hands. Put on green branches, said Maurice. That's the best way to make smoke. I've got the conch. And Jack turned fiercely. You shut up. And Piggy whittled. Ralph took the conch away from him and looked around the circle of the boys. We've got to have special people for looking after the fire. Any day there may be a ship out there. He waved his arm at the taut wire on the horizon. And if we have a signal going, they'll come and take us off. And another thing, we ought to have more rules. Where the conch is, that's a meeting. The same up here is down there. So they're adding on rules, more civilization. They assented, and Piggy opened his mouth to speak, caught Jack's eye, and shut it again. Jack held out his hands for the conch and stood up, holding the delicate thing in his sooty hands. I agree with Ralph. We've got to have rules and obey them. After all, we're not savages. We're English, and the English are best at everything. So we've got to do the right things. And he turned to Ralph. Ralph, I'll split up my choir, my hunters, that is, into groups, and we'll be responsible for keeping the fire going. This generosity brought a spatter of applause from the boys, so that Jack grinned at them and then waved the conch for silence. We'll let the fire burn out now. Who would see smoke at nighttime anyways? And we can start the fire again whenever we like. Altos, you can keep the fire going this week, and trebles the next. And the assembly assented gravely. And we'll be responsible for keeping a lookout too. If we see a ship out there, they follow the direction of his bony arm with their eyes. We'll put green branches on, and then there'll be more smoke. And they gazed intently at the dense blue of the horizon, and if a light silhouette might appear at any moment. The sun in the west was a drop of burning gold that slid nearer and nearer the sill of the world. All at once they were aware of this evening, the end of the light and the warmth. Jack took the conch and looked around at them gloomily. I've been watching the sea, and there hasn't been a trace of a ship. Perhaps we'll never be rescued. A murmur rose and swept away, and Ralph looked back at the conch. I said before we'll be rescued sometime. We've just got to wait, that's all. Daring and indignant, Piggy took the conch. That's what I said. I said about our meetings and things, and then you said shut up. His voice stirred into the whine of virtuous recrimination. They stirred and began to shout him down. You said you wanted a small fire, and you've gone and built a pile like a hayrick. If I say anything, cried Piggy, with bitter realism, you say shut up. But if Jack or Maurice or Simon. He paused in the turbulence, standing looking beyond them and down on the unfriendly side of the mountain to the great patch where they had found dead wood. Then he laughed so strangely that they were hushed, looking at the gaze of his spectacles in astonishment, and they followed his gaze to find the sour joke. You've got your small fire, all right. Smoke was rising here and there among the creepers that festooned like dead or dying trees, and as they watched, a flash of fire reappeared at the root of one wisp, and then the smoke thickened. Small flames stirred at the bole of a tree and crawled away through the leaves in the brushwood, dividing and increasing. One patch touched the tree trunk and scrambled up like a bright squirrel. The smoke increased, sifted, and rolled outwards. The squirrels leapt on the wings of the wind and clutched to another standing tree, eating downwards. Beneath the dark canopy of leaves and smoke, the fire laid hold on the forest and began to gnaw. Acres of black and yellow smoke rolled steadily towards the sea, and at the sight of the flame and the irresistible course of the fire, the boys broke into a shrill, excited cheering. The flames, as though they were a kind of wildlife, crept as a jaguar creeps on its belly towards a line of birch-like saplings that fledged on an outcrop of the pink rock. They flapped at the first of the trees, and the branches grew a brief foliage of fire. The heart of the flame leapt nimbly across the gap from the trees and then went swinging and flaring across the whole row of them. Beneath the capering boys, a quarter of a mile of forest was savage with smoke and flame, and the separate noises of the fire mingled in with a drum roll that seemed to shake the mountain. You've got your small fire, all right. Startled, Ralph realized that the boys were fallen still in silence, feeling the beginnings of awe at the power set free before them. The knowledge and awe made him savage. Oh, shut up. I've got the conch, said Piggy in a hurt voice. I've got a right to speak. They looked at him with eyes that lacked interest in what they saw. They cocked ears at the drum roll of the fire, and Piggy glanced nervously into hell and cradled the conch. The conch. We've got to let that burn out now. That was our firewood. He licked his lips. There ain't nothing we can do. We ought to be more careful. I'm scared. And Jack dragged his eyes away from the fire. You're always scared. Yeah, fatty. I've got the conch, said Piggy bleakly. He turned to Ralph. I've got the conch, ain't I, Ralph? And unwillingly, Ralph turned away from the splendid, awful sight. What's that? I've got the conch. I've got a right to speak. And the twins giggled together. We wanted smoke, and now look. A pall stretched for miles across the island. All the boys except Piggy started to giggle. Presently, they were shrieking with laughter, and Piggy lost his temper. I've got the conch. Just you listen. The first thing we ought to have made was a shelter down there by the beach. It wasn't half as cold down there in the night. But the first time Ralph says fire, you go howling and screaming up this mountain like a pack of kids. By now, they were listening to the tyrant. How can you expect to be rescued if you don't put first things first and act proper? He took off his glasses and made as if to put down the conch, but the sudden motion towards it of most of the older boys changed his mind. He tucked his shell under his arm and crouched back on a rock. Then when you get here, you build a bonfire that isn't no use. Now you've been and set the whole island on fire. Won't we look funny if the whole island burns up? Cooked fruit, that's what we'll have to eat, and roast pork. And that's nothing to laugh at. You said Ralph was the chief, and you don't give him time to think. Then when he says something, you rush off like that. He paused for breath, and the fire growled at them. And that's not all. Them kids, the little ones, who took any notice of them? Who knows how many we got? And Ralph took a step forward. I told you to. I told you to get a list of names. How could I? Cried Piggy indignantly. All by myself? They waited for 2 minutes, and then they fell into the sea. They went into the forest. They just scattered everywhere. How was I to know which was which? And Ralph licked his pale lips. Then you don't know how many of us there ought to be? How could I with them, these little ones, round like insects? And then when you three came back, as soon as you said make a fire, they all ran away, and I never had a chance. That's enough, said Ralph sharply, and he snatched back the conch. If you didn't, you didn't. Then you come back here and pinch my specs. And Jack turned on him. You shut up. And then the little ones were wandering about down there where the fire is. How do you know they still aren't there? And Piggy stood up and pointed towards the smoke and the flames. A murmur rose among the boys and died away. Something strange was happening to Piggy, for he was gasping for breath. That little un, gasped Piggy. With him with the mark on his face. I don't see him. Where is he now? And the crowd was as silent as death. Him that talked about snakes, he was down there. A tree exploded in the fire like a bomb, and tall swathes of creepers rose for a moment, agonized, and went down again. And the little boy screamed at him, "Snakes, snakes! Look at the snakes!" In the west, and the unheated sun lay only an inch or two above the sea, and their faces were lit redly from beneath. Piggy fell against a rock and clutched it with both hands. That little one had a mark on his face. Where is he now? I tell you, I don't see him. And the boys looked at each other fearfully, unbelieving. Where is he now? Ralph muttered the reply as if in shame. Perhaps he went to the, and beneath them, on the unfriendly side of the mountain, the drum roll continued. And so that is the end of chapter 2.
Who was the one with the scar or something?
That one with the scar was the boy who was talking about like the snakes and stuff and the beasts.
Did he have a name?
He did not have a name, no. In fact, most of the little ones will not have a name. So I'm going to do a really quick plot summary here of this stuff here. So this is just on chapter 2. So I'll give you a second to head there. For this book, there's a lot, so we'll just be doing it chapter by chapter. I'll give you a second to get there.
Do you have any more of these?
Hey. So, starting out here, so chapter 2. So it starts with our meeting here, right? This is when they come back, it starts with a meeting, and this is where it's agreed that whoever has the conch, the shell, is the one who speaks, and everyone listens. So we start to get rule of law. So there's an agreement on rules. So we also, there's also an establishment of a couple things. A lot of the boys. A lot of the boys, especially the young ones, become afraid of a beastie or a snake. There's also an agreement to start a rescue fire. And so with this fire, they use Piggy's glasses. Oh, come on. They use Piggy's glasses to start it. And it grows out of control. And ultimately, one of the boys is missing. And finally, again, we see Piggy is ignored more. Some more water. We'll continue with chapter 3 here in a minute. I'm gonna try and get us to finish chapter 4 today is the goal. Normally we try and do 2 chapters at a time. But today we'll be kind of powering through. Yeah. So starting out here with chapter 3. So this is Huts on the Beach. So one thing I actually, before I even start that, this missing boy, he's dead. He's gone. He died in the fire. Is really what they hinted at. It's referenced kind of later on, but that's what happened is like he passes away. So chapter 3, Huts on the Beach. Jack was bent double and he was down like a sprinter, his nose only a few inches from the humid earth. The tree trunks and the creepers that festooned them lost themselves in a green dusk 30 feet above him. And all of that was in the undergrowth. There was only the faintest indication of a trail here, a cracked twig of what may be an impression of one side and a hoof. He lowered his chin and stared at the traces as though he would force them to speak to him. Then dog-like, uncomfortably, on all fours, yet unheeded in his discomfort, he stole forward 5 yards and stopped. And here was a loop of a creeper with a tendril pendant from a node, and the tendril was polished on the underside. Pigs passed into the loop and brushed it with their bristly hide. Jack was crouched with his face a few inches from this clue, and then stared forward into the semi-darkness of the undergrowth. His sandy hair, considered longer than it had been when they had dropped in, was lighter now, and his bare back was a mass of dark freckles and peeling sunburn. A sharpened stick of about 5 feet long trailed from his right hand, and except for a pair of tattered shorts held up by a knife belt, he was naked. He closed his eyes, raised his head, and breathed in gently with flared nostrils, assessing the current of warm air for information. The forest and he were very still. At length, he let out his breath in a long sigh and opened his eyes, and they were bright blue eyes that the frustration seemed bolted and nearly mad. He passed his tongue across dry lips and scanned the uncommunicative forest, and then he stole forward and cast this way and that over the ground. The silence of the forest was more oppressive than the heat, and at this hour of the day there was not even the whine of insects. Only when Jack himself roused the gaudy bird from the primitive nest of sticks was the silence shattered and the echoes set right in by a harsh cry that seemed to come out of the abyss of ages. Jack himself shrank at this cry in a hiss of indrawn breath, and for a minute became less of a hunter than a furtive thing, ape-like among the tangles of trees. And then the trail, the frustration, claimed him again, and he searched the ground avidly. By the bore of the vast tree that grew pale flowers on the gray trunk, he checked, closed his eyes, and once more drew in the warm air. And this time the breath came short, and there was a never-passing pallor on his face, and then the surge of blood again. He passed like a shadow under the darkness of the tree and crouched, looking down at the trodden ground at his feet. The drop-ins were warm. They lay piled among earth, and they were olive green, smooth, and they steamed a little. Jack lifted his head and stared at the inscrutable masses of creeper that lay across the trail. Then he raised his spear and sneaked forward. Beyond the creeper, the trail joined a pig run that was wide enough and trodden enough to be a path, and the ground was hardened by the accustomed tread, and as Jack rose to his full height, he heard something moving on it. He swung back his right arm and hurled the spear with all his strength. And from the pig run came the quick, hard patter of hoofs, a castanent sound, seductive, maddening, the promise of meat. He rushed out of the undergrowth and snatched up his spear. The pardon of the pig's trotters died away in an instant. Jack had stood there, steaming with sweat, streaked with the brown earth, and stained by the vicissitudes of the day's hunting. Swearing, he turned off the trail and pushed his way through the forest, open a little. And then instead of bald trunks supporting the dark roof, there were light gray trunks and a crown of feathery palm. Beyond these was the glitter of the sea, and he could hear voices. Ralph was standing by a contraption of palm trunks and leaves and a rude shelter that faced the lagoon, and it seemed very near to falling down. He did not notice when Jack spoke. Got any water? Ralph looked up, frowning from the complication of leaves. He did not notice Jack even when he saw him. I said, "Have you got any water? I'm thirsty." Ralph withdrew his attention from the shelter and realized Jack with a start. "Oh, hello, water? There by the tree. Ought to be some left." And Jack took up a coconut shell that brimmed with fresh water from one a group that were arranged in the shade, and then drank. The water splashed over his chin and neck and chest, and he breathed noisily when he had finished. Needed that. And Simon spoke up from inside the shelter, up a bit. Ralph turned towards the shelter and lifted a branch with a whole tiling of leaves. The leaves came apart and fluttered down, and Simon's contrite face appeared in the hole. Sorry. Ralph surveyed the wreck with distaste. Never get it done. He flung himself down at Jack's feet, and Simon remained, looking out at the hole of the shelter. Once again, Ralph explained. Been working for days now, and look. 2 shelters were in position, but shaky. This one was a ruin, and they keep running off. You remember the meetings, how everyone was going to work hard until the shelters were finished. Except me and my hunters. Except the hunters. Well, the little ones are. He gesticulated, sought for a word. They're hopeless. The older ones aren't much better. Do you see? All day I've been working with Simon. No one else. They're off bathing or eating or playing. Simon poked his head out carefully. You're chief. You tell him off. Ralph lay flat and looked down at the palm trees and the sky. Meetings. Don't we love meetings? Every day, twice a day. We talk. He got in on one elbow. I bet if I blew this conch this minute, they'd come running. And then we'd be, very solemn. And someone would say we ought to build a jet or a submarine or a TV set. And then when the meeting was over, they'd work for 5 minutes and then wander off or go hunting. And Jack flushed. We want meat. Well, we haven't got any yet, and we want shelters. Besides, the rest of your hunters came back hours ago. They've been swimming. So both of them are struggling to, motivate people. I went on, said Jack. I let them go. I had to go on. He tried to convey the compulsion to track down and kill the thing that was swallowing him up. I went on, I thought to myself, but again, the madness came to his eyes. I thought I might kill. But you didn't. I thought I might. But some hidden passion had vibrated in Ralph's voice, but you haven't yet. And his invitation might have passed as casual, were it not for the undertone. You wouldn't care to help with these shelters, I suppose. We want meat, and we don't get it. Now the antagonism was audible. But I shall next time. I've got to get a barb on the spear. What we wounded a pig and the spear fell out. If only we could make barbs. We need shelters. And suddenly Jack shouted in rage. Are you accusing? All I'm saying is we've worked dashed hard. That's all. And they were both red in the face and found looking at each other difficult. Ralph rolled on his stomach and began to play with the grass. If it rains when we dropped in, we'll need shelters, all right. And then another thing, we need shelters because of the. He paused for a moment and they both pushed their anger away. Then he went on with the safe change subject. You've noticed, haven't you? Jack put down his spear and squatted. Noticed what? Well, they're frightened. He rolled over and peered into Jack's face. Jack's fierce, dirty face. I mean, the way things are, they dream. You can hear them. Have you been awake at night? And Jack shook his head. They talk and scream, the little ones. Even some of the others, as if it wasn't a good island. Astonished at the interruption, I looked up at Simon's serious face. As if, said Simon, the beastie of the snake thing was real, remember? And the two older boys flinched when they heard the shameful syllable. Snake was not mentioned now. We're not mentionable. As if this wasn't a good island, said Ralph slowly. Yes, that's right. And Jack sat up and stretched out his legs. They're batty. Crackers, remember when we went exploring? They grinned at each other, remembering the glamour of the first day. And Ralph went on. So we need shelters as a sort of home. That's right. And Jack drew up his legs, clasped his knees, and frowned in an effort to attain clarity. All the same, in the forest, I mean when you're hunting. Not when you're getting fruit, of course, but when you're on your own. He paused for a moment, not sure if Ralph would take him seriously. Go on. If you're hunting, sometimes you catch yourself feeling as if he flushed suddenly. There's nothing in it, of course, just a feeling. But you can feel it as if you're not hunting, but being hunted. As if something's behind you all the time in the jungle. So that is going to be an allegory, and I will come back to that at some point here throughout the novel. So again, that as if something's behind you all the time in the jungle. It feels like you're not hunting, but rather being hunted. And they were silent again. Simon intense, Ralph incredulous with faintly indignation. He sat up, rubbed one's shoulders with a dirty hand. Well, I don't know. And Jack left to his feet and spoke very quickly. That's how you can feel in the forest. Of course, there isn't nothing in it. Only. He took a few rapid steps towards the beach and then came back. Only I know how they feel. See, that's all. The best thing we can do is get ourselves rescued. And Jack had to think for a moment before he could remember what rescued was. Yes, rescue. Yes, of course. All the same, I'd like to catch a pig first. And he snatched up the spear and dashed it into the ground. The opaque, mad look came into his eyes again, and Ralph looked at him critically through the tangle of fair hair. So long as you're hunters, remember the fire. You and your fire. And the two boys trotted down to the beach and, turning at the water's edge, looked back at the pink mountain. The trickle of smoke stretched the chalky line of the solid blue of the sky, wavered high and faded, and Ralph frowned. I wonder how far off you could see that. Miles. We don't make enough smoke. The bottom part of the trickle, as though conscious of their gaze, thickened to a creamy blur which crept up the feeble column. They put on green branches, muttered Ralph. I wonder. He screwed up his eyes and swung round to search the horizon. Got it. And Jack shouted so loudly that Ralph jumped. What? Where is that? Is it a ship? But Jack was pointing out to the high declivities that led down from the mountain to the flatter part of the island. Of course, they'll lie up there. They must do when the sun's too hot. And Ralph gazed bewilderedly at his rapt face. They get up high up in the shade, resting during the heat, like cows at home. I thought you saw a ship. We could steal up on one, paint our faces so they wouldn't see, perhaps surround them, and then indignation took away Ralph's control. I was talking about the smoke. Don't you want to be rescued? All you can talk about is pig, pig, pig. But we want meat, and I work all day with nothing but Simon, and you come back and you don't even notice the hut. I was working too. But you like it, shouted Ralph. You want to hunt, while I, and they faced each other on the bright beast, astonished at the rub of the feeling, and Ralph looked away at first, pretending interest in a group of little ones on the sand. From beyond the platform came the shouting of the hunters in the swimming pool. On the one end of the platform, Piggy was lying flat, looking down to the brilliant water. People don't help much. He wanted to explain how people were never quite what you thought they were. So again, people were never quite people were never quite what you thought they were. And so right now, if we think about, like, what do the other boys think of these people? When they think about Piggy, they think he's useless, right? But Piggy's actually pretty logical. He's coming up with good ideas. When they look at Ralph, they think he's, they think he's a leader and he's confident, but he's actually not. When they look at Jack, they think he's this crazy hunter, but in reality, he's not, right? Like he was the one who like kind of let the pig go and stuff. So that's a pretty powerful quote to kind of have in our arsenal here if we ever end up talking about this. So Simon, he helps. He pointed at the shelters, and all the rest rushed off. He's done as much as I have. Only Simon's always about. And Ralph started back to the shelters with Jack by his side. Do a bit for you, muttered Jack, before I have a bath. Don't bother. And when they reached the shelter, Simon was not to be seen. Ralph put his head into the hole, withdrew it, and then turned back to Jack. He's buzzed off. He got fed off, said Jack, and gone for a bath. And Ralph frowned. He's queer. He's funny. Jack nodded as much for the sake of agreeing than anything, and by the tacit consent, they left the shelter and went towards the bathing pool. And then said Jack, when I've had a bath and something to eat, I'll just trek over to the other side of the mountain and see if I can get any traces. Coming? But the sun's nearly set. I might have time. And they walked off. They walked along, too confident of experience and feeling, unable to communicate. If only I could get a pig. I'll come back and go on with the shelter. And they looked at each other, baffled, in love and hate. All the warm salt water of the bathing pool and the shouting and the splashing and laughing were only just sufficient to bring them together again. Simon, who they expected to find there, was not in the bathing pool. When the other two had trotted down to the beach to look back at the mountain, he had followed them for a few yards and then stopped. He stood frowning down at a pile of sand on the beach where somebody had been trying to make a little house or hut. Then he turned his back on this and walked into the forest with an air of purpose. He was a small, skinny boy, his chin pointed and his eyes so bright that they had deceived Ralph into thinking him delightfully gay and wicked. And when they're talking about queer and gay here, like, yeah, this is written in the 1950s. We're talking about like, we're talking about be happy and weird. The coarse mop of black hair was long and swung down and concealing a low, broad forehead. He wore the remains of shorts, and his feet were bare like Jack's, always darkish in color. Simon was burned by the sun to a deep tan that glistened with sweat. He picked his way up the scar, passing the great rock to where Ralph had climbed on the first morning, and then turned off to the right among the trees. He walked with an accustomed tread through the acres of fruit trees where the least energetic could find an easy, if unsatisfying, meal. Flower and fruit grew together on the same tree, and everywhere was the scent of ripeness and the booming of a million bees at pasture. Here, the little ones who had run after him caught up with him, and they talked, cried out unintelligibly, lured him towards the trees. And then, amid the roar of bees in the afternoon sunlight, Simon found for them the fruit that they could not reach, pulled off from the choicest from up in the foliage, passed them back down to the endless outstretched hands. And when he had satisfied them, he paused and looked around. The little ones watched him with inscrutably over double handcupfuls of ripe fruit. Simon turned away from them and went where the just perceptible path had led him. Soon high jungle closed in, and tall trunks bore unexpected pale flowers all the way up the dark canopy where life went on clamorously. The air here was dark too, and creepers dropped their ropes like the rigging of founded ships. His feet left prints in the wood and the soft soil. His feet left prints in the soft soil, and the creepers shivered throughout the lengths where he bumped them. He came at last to a place where the sunshine fell. Since they had not had so far to go for light, the creepers had woven a great mat that hung at the side of an open space in the jungle. From here, a patch of rock came close to the surface and would not allow more than little plants and ferns to grow. The whole space had walled up the dark aromatic bushes and was a bowl of heat and light. The great tree, fallen across from one corner, leaned against the trees that stood still, and rapid climber flaunted red and yellow sprays right over to the top. Simon paused and he looked over his shoulder as Jack had done as the close ways behind him and glanced swiftly round to confirm that he was utterly alone. For a moment, his movements were almost furtive, and then he bent down and wormed his way towards the center of the mat. The creepers and the bushes were so close that he left his sweat on them as they pulled together behind him. When he was secure in the middle, he was in a small cabin, screened off from the open space by a few leaves. He squatted down, parted the leaves, and looked out into the clearing. Nothing moved but a pair of gaudy butterflies that danced round each other in the hot air. Holding his breath when he cocked a critical ear to the sounds of the island, the evening was advancing towards the island, and the sounds of bright, fantastic birds, the bee sounds, and even the crying of the gulls were returned to their roosts among the square rocks were fainter. The deep sea breaking miles away on the reefs made an undertone less perceptible than the susurration of blood. Simon dropped the screen of leaves back into place, and the slope of the bars of honey-colored sunlight decreased, and they slid up the bushes, passed over the green candle buds, moved towards the canopy, and the darkness thickened under the trees. With the fading of the light, the riotous colors died with the heat, and the urgency cooled away. The candle buds stirred, and the green sepals drew back a little with the white tips of the flowers rising delicately to meet the open air. Now the sunlight had drifted clear of the open space and withdrawn from the sky. Darkness poured in, submerging the ways between the trees till they were dim and strange as the bottom of the sea. And the candle buds opened their wide white flowers with glimmering under the lights that pricked down from the first star. The scent spilled out of the open air and took possession of the island. And so that is the end of chapter 3. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. We'll quickly. Where are we on? We're page 60. Yeah, okay, we'll quickly do this and then we'll take our break early. So plot summary here for chapter 3. Not a whole lot. Basically, what we know is that Jack tries to build or to hunt, but fails. Ralph tries to build a hut. Notably, that was Piggy's suggestion, but fails. And not only that, everyone except Simon and those two, except Jack, except Ralph, except Simon, are not. Are not helping out. Right? They'll help for 5 minutes and then they'll wander off. They'll get bored. They'll go do something. They'll go play. They'll go find fruit, whatever it is. We find out that so Jack does not care about the fire, and the fire is rescue, right? Jack does not care about the fire. He does not care about the huts. The only thing Jack cares about is hunting. Jack only cares about hunting. And we start to see the relationship strain here a little bit, right? And then Simon's a little odd here. So Simon, eventually, Simon goes to a hidden, secret nature hideaway. He's found some little place where he can go and he can be away from everyone else. So we're going to start chapter 4 here. My hope is we will finish chapter 5 today, because it works out really nicely if we're able to power through and just do 2 a day, but we'll see. So we're going on to chapter 4 here, painted faces and long hair. Let's chug some water. The first rhythm that they became used to was the slow swing from dawn to quick dusk, and they accepted the pleasures of the morning, the bright sun, the Whelman sea, and the sweet air, as a time when play was good and life was so full of hope. That life was so full that hope was not necessary, and therefore forgotten. Towards noon, as the flood of light fell more nearly to the perpendicular, the stark colors of the morning were smoothed in pearl and opalescence, and the heat, as though impending the sun's height, gave it momentum, became a blow as they ducked, run into the shade and lying there, perhaps even sleeping. Strange things happened at midday. The glittering sea rose up and moved apart in places of blatant impossibility. The coral reef and the few stunted palms that clung to the more elevated parts would float up into the sky, would quiver and be plucked apart, run in like raindrops on a wire, or to be repeated in an odd succession of mirrors. Sometimes land loomed where there was no land and flicked out like a bulb as the children watched. And Piggy discounted all this learnedly as a mirage. And since no body could ever reach the reef over the stretch of the water where the snapped sharks waited, they grew accustomed to those mysteries and ignored them. And just as they ignored the miraculously throbbing stars. At midday, the illusions merged into the sky and the sun gazed down like an angry eye. Then, at the end of the afternoon, the mirage subsided and the horizon became level and blue and clipped as the sun declined. There was another time of comparative coolness, but menaced by the coming of dark. When the sun sank, darkness dropped on the island like an extinguisher, and soon the shelters were full of restlessness under the remote stars. Nevertheless, the Northern European tradition of work, play, and food throughout the day made it impossible for them to adjust themselves wholly to this new rhythm. The little and Percival, who had early crawled into a shelter and stayed there for 2 days, talking, singing, and crying till they thought him batty and were faintly amused. Ever since then, he had peaked, red-eyed, and miserable, a little one who played little and cried often. The smaller boys were known now by the generic title of little ones. The decrease in size from Ralph down was gradual, and though there was a dubious region inhabited by Simon and Robert and Maurice, nevertheless, no one had any difficulty in recognizing big uns at one end and little uns at the other. The undoubted little ones, those who aged about 6, led a quite distinct and almost at the same time intense life of their own. They ate most of the day, picking fruits where they could reach it, and not particular about the rightness or quality. They were used now to stomach aches and a sort of chronic diarrhea. They suffered untold nightmares in the dark and huddled together for comfort, and apart from food and sleep, they found time for play, aimless and trivial, among the white sand and the bright water. They cried for their mothers much less often than might have been expected. They were very brown and filthily dirty, and they obeyed the summons of the conch, partly because Ralph blew it, and he was big enough to be a link with the adult world of authority, and partly because they enjoyed the entertainment of the assemblies, but otherwise they seldom bothered with the biggins, and their passionately emotional and corporate life was their own. They had built castles at the foot of the little river, and these castles were about 1 foot high and were decorated with shells, withered flowers, and interesting stones. Round the castles was a complex of marks, tracks, walls, railway lines, and they were significant only if inspected with the eye at beach level. And the little ones played here, if not happily, at least with absorbed attention, and often as many as 3 of them would play the same game together. 3 were here now, and Henry was the biggest of them. He was also a distant relative of that other boy whose mulberry-marked face had not been seen since the evening of the great fire. But he was not old enough to understand this, and if he had been told that the other boys would have gone home in an aircraft, he would have accepted the statement without fuss or disbelief. Henry was a bit of a leader this afternoon, because the other 2 were Percival and Johnny, the smallest boys on the island. Percival was a mouse-colored and had not been very attractive even to his mother. Johnny was well built, with a fair hair and a natural belligerence. Just now he was being obedient because he was interested, and the 3 children kneeling in the sand were at peace. Roger and Maurice came out of the forest, and they were relieved from duty at the fire and came down from the swim. Roger led the way straight through the castle, kicking them over, burying the flowers, scattering the chosen stones. Maurice followed, laughing and adding to the destruction. The 3 little ones paused in their game and looked up. As it happened, the particular marks in which they were interested had not been touched. so they made no protest. Only Percival began to whimper at an eyeful of sand, and Maurice hurried away. In his other life, Maurice had received chastisement for filling a younger eye with sand. Now, though there was no parent to let fall a heavy ban, Maurice still felt the unease of wrongdoing. At the back of his mind formed the uncertain outline of an excuse. He muttered something about a swim and broke off into a trot. Ralph remained watching the little ones. He was not noticeably darker than when he had dropped in, but the shock of black hair draped down his nape and low on his forehead seemed to suit his gloomy face and made what seemed at first an unsociable remoteness into something forbidden. Percival finished his whimper and went on playing, and tears had washed the sand away. And Johnny watched him with china blue eyes and then began to clean up sand in the shower, and presently Percival was crying again. When Henry, tired of his play and wandered off along the beach, Roger followed him, and keeping beneath the palms and drifting casually in the same direction, Henry walked at a distance from the palms and the sun because he was too young to keep himself out of the sun. He went down to the beach and busied himself at the water's edge, and the great Pacific tide was coming in, and every few seconds was relatively still water, and the lagoon heaved forwards an inch. There were creatures that lived in the last lane of the sea, tiny transparencies that came westing in with the water over the hot, dry sand. With impalpable organs of sense, they examined this new field. Perhaps food had dropped, but the last incursion had been none. Birds dropping, insects perhaps, any of the strewn detritus of landward life. Like a myriad of tiny teeth in a saw, the transparencies came scavenging over the beach. This was fascinating to Henry. He had poked around with a bit of a stick, and that was the wave-worn and whiting with a vagrant, and tried to control the motions of the scavengers. He made little tunnels that the tide filled in order to crowd them with creatures. He became absorbed and beyond mere happiness as he felt himself exercising control over living things. He talked to them, urging them, ordering them, and driven back by the tide, his footprints became bays in which they were trapped and gave him the illusion of mastery. He squatted on the hams at the water's edge, bowed, with a shock of hair falling over his forehead and parts past his eyes, and in the afternoon sun emptied down the invisible arrows. Roger waited too, but at first he had hidden behind a great palm bowl, but Henry's absorption with the transparencies was so obvious that at last he stood out in full view. He looked along the beach, and Percival had gone off crying, and Johnny was left in triumphant possession of the castles. And he sat there, crooning to himself and throwing sand at an imaginary Percival. Beyond him, Roger could see the platform and the glint of spray where Ralph and Simon and Piggy and Maurice were diving in the pool. He listened carefully, but he could only just hear them. A sudden breeze shook the fringe of the palm trees so that the fronds tossed and fluttered. 60 feet above Roger, a cluster of nuts, fibrous lumps as big as rugby balls, were loosed from their stems, and they fell about him with a series of hard thumps, and he was not touched. Roger did not consider his escape, but looked from nuts to Henry and back again, and the subsoil beneath the palm trees was a raised beach, and the generations of palms had worked loose in this time the stones that had lain on the sands of another shore. Roger stopped, picked up a stone, aimed, and threw it at Henry, threw it to miss. That stone, that token of preposterous time, bounced 5 yards to Henry's right and fell in the water. Roger grabbed a handful of stones and began to throw them. There was a space around Henry, perhaps 6 yards in diameter, into which he dare not throw. Yet, here, invisible yet strong, was the taboo of the old life. Round the squatting child was the protection of parents and policemen and the law. Roger's arm was conditioned by a civilization that he knew nothing of him and was in ruins. So again, he knows that, he's not supposed to throw a rock at this little kid and not actually hit him, right? So he's conditioned to not do that. Henry was surprised by the plopping sounds on the water, and he abandoned the noiseless transparencies and pointed at the center of the spreading rings like a setter. This side and the stones fell, and Henry turned obediently, but was always too late to see the stones in the air. At last he threw one and laughed, looking for a friend who was teasing him, but Roger had whipped behind the palm bowl again, was leaning against it, breathing quickly, his eyelids fluttering. and then Henry lost interest in the stones and wandered off. Roger. Jack was standing under a tree about 10 yards away. When Roger opened his eyes and saw him, a darker shadow crept beneath the swarthness of his skin, but Jack noticed nothing. He was eager, impatient, beckoning, so that Roger went to him. There was a pool at the end of the river, a tiny mere dammed back by sand and full of white water lilies and needle-like reeds. Here, Sam and Eric were waiting, and Bill, Jack concealed from the sun, knelt by the pool and opened the large leaves that he carried. One of them contained white clay and the other red. By them lay a stick of charcoal brought down from the fire. Jack explained to Roger as he worked. They don't smell me. They don't see me, I think. Something pink under the trees. He smeared on the clay. If only he had some green. He turned a half-concealed face to Roger and answered the comprehension of his gaze. For hunting, like in the war, dazzle paint. Like things that try to look like something else. So, they're going to use it as war paint. He twisted the urgency of telling, like moss on a tree trunk. And Roger understood and nodded gravely. The twins moved towards Jack and began to protest timidly about something, but Jack waved them away. Shut up. He rubbed the control sticks between the patches of red and white on his face. No, you two come with me. He peered at the reflection and disliked it. He bent down, took up a handful of lukewarm water, and rubbed the mess from his face, and freckles and sandy eyebrows reappeared. Roger smiled unwillingly. You don't look half a mess. And Jack planned his new face. He made one cheek and one eye socket white, and then rubbed red over the other half of his face, and then slashed the black bar charcoal across from the right ear to the left jaw. He looked in the mirror for his reflection, and his breathing troubled the mirror. Sam and Eric, get me a coconut, an empty one. He knelt, holding the shell of water, and a rounded patch of sunlight fell on his face, and brightness appeared in the depths of the water. He looked in astonishment, no longer at himself, but at an awesome stranger. He spilt the water and leapt to his feet, laughing excitedly. Beside the mirror, his sinewy body began to held up a mask that drew their eyes and appalled them. He began to dance, and his laughter became a bloodthirsty snarling. He capered towards Bill, and the mask was a thing of its own, behind which Jack hid, liberated from the shame and self-consciousness. The face of red and white and black, swinging through the air and jigged towards Bill. Bill started up laughing, and then suddenly he fell silent and blundered away towards the bushes. Jack rushed towards the twins. The rest are making a line. Come on, come on. I'll creep up and stab. The mask compelled them. So this mask is going to have a deeper symbolic meaning that we will end up talking about probably tomorrow. But so Jack specifically, Jack Merridew having this mask does mean something. So this is an important quote with future context. So Ralph climbed out of the bathing pool and trotted up the beach and sat in the shade beneath the palms. Sorry, taking one note of something. His fair hair was plastered over his eyebrows and pushed it back, and Simon was floating in the water and kicking with his feet, and Maurice was practicing diving. Piggy was mooning about, aimlessly picking up things and discarding them. The rock pools, which so fascinated him, were covered by the tide, so that he was without an interest until the tide went back. Presently, seeing Ralph under the palms, he came and sat by him. Piggy wore the remainders of a pair of shorts. His fat body was golden brown, and his glasses still flashed when he looked at anything. He was the only boy in the island whose hair never seemed to grow. The rest were shock-headed, but Piggy's hair still lay in wisps over his head as though baldness were his natural state. And this imperfect covering would soon go, like a velvet on a young stag's antlers. I've been thinking, he said, about a clock. We could make a sundial, we could make a stick in the sand, and then the effort to express the mathematical process involved was too great. He made a few passes instead. And an airplane and a TV set, said Ralph sourly, and a steam engine. And Ralph shook his head. You have to have a lot of metal things for that, he said. And we haven't got no metal, but we got a stick. And Ralph turned and smiled involuntarily. Piggy was a bore. His fat, his asthma, his matter-of-fact ideas were dull, but there was always a little pleasure to get out of pulling his legs, even if one did it by accident. So again, like this is how they view Piggy, right? He's boring. He's a dull. His ideas were duller. Piggy saw the smile and misinterpreted it as friendliness. They had grown up tactily among the big guns the opinion that Piggy was an outsider, not only by accent, which did not matter, but by fat and asthma and specs and a certain disinclination for manual labor. Now, finding that something he had said had made Ralph smile, he rejoiced and pressed his advantage. We've got a lot of sticks. We could have a sundial each. Then we should know what time it was. A lot of good that would do. But you said you wanted things done, so we could be rescued. Oh, shut up. He leapt to his feet and trotted back to the pool. And just as Maurice did a rather cool dive, Ralph was glad of the chance to change the subject. He shouted as Maurice came up to the surface, belly flop, belly flop. Maurice smiled at Ralph, who slid easily into the water. Of all the boys, he was the most at home there. But today, irked by the mention of rescue, the useless footlong mention of rescue, even at the great green depths of the water and the shattered golden sun held no balm. Instead of remaining and playing, he swam with steady strokes under Simon and crawled out of the underside of the pool to lie there, sleek and streaming like a seal. Piggy, always clumsy, stood up and came to stand by him, so that Ralph rolled on his stomach and pretended not to see. The mirages had died away, and gloomily he ran his eyes along the taut blue line of the horizon. The next moment he was on his feet and shouting, "Smoke, smoke." Maurice tried to sit up in the water and got a mouthful. Maurice, who had been standing ready to dive, swayed back on his heels, made a bolt for the platform, and then swerved back to the grass under the palms. There he started to pull on his tattered shoes to be ready for anything. Ralph stood on one side of the chair, the other clenched. Simon was climbing out of the water, and Piggy was rubbing his glasses on his shorts and squinting at the seas. Maurice had gotten both legs to one leg of his shorts. All the boys, only Ralph was still. "I can't see no smoke," said Piggy incredulously. "I can't see no smoke. Ralph, where is it?" And Ralph said nothing. Now both his hands were clenched over his forehead so that the fair hair was kept out of his eyes. He was leaning forward, and already the salt was whitening his body. "Ralph, where's the ship?" Simon stood by, looking from Ralph to the horizon, and Maurice's trousers gave way with a sigh and abandoned them as a wreck, rushed towards the forest, and then came back again. The smoke was a tiny little knot on the horizon and was uncoiling slowly. Beneath the smoke was a dot that might be a funnel, and Ralph's face was as pale as he spoke to himself. "They'll see our smoke." Piggy was looking in the right direction now. It don't take much. He turned round and peered up the mountain. Ralph continued to watch the ship ravenously. Color was coming back to his face, and Simon stood by him, silent. "I know I can't see very much," said Piggy, "but have we got any smoke?" And Ralph moved impatiently, still watching the ship, the smoke on the mountain. Maurice came running and stared out to the sea, and both Simon and Piggy were looking up at the mountain. Piggy screwed up his face, but Simon cried out as though he had hurt himself, "Ralph, Ralph." The quality of his speech slewed Ralph on the sand. "You tell me," said Piggy anxiously, "is there a signal?" Ralph looked back at the dispensing smoke on the horizon and then up at the mountain. "Ralph, please, is there a signal?" Ralph put out his hands timidly to touch Ralph. Simon put out his hands timidly to touch Ralph, but Ralph started to run, splashing through the shallow end of the bathing pool, across the hot, white sand, under the palms. A moment later, he was battling with the complex undergrowth that had already engulfed the scar, and Simon ran after him, and then Maurice and Piggy shouted, "Ralph, please, Ralph." Then he too started to run, stumbling over Maurice's discarded shorts before he was across the terrace. Behind the four boys, the smoke moved gently along the horizon, and on the beach, Henry and Johnny were throwing sand at Percival, who was crying quietly again. And again, all three were in complete ignorance of the excitement. By this time, Ralph had reached the landward end of the scar and was using his precious breath to swear. He did not desperate violence to his naked body among the rasping creepers, so that blood was sliding over him. Just when the steep ascent of the mountain began, he stopped. Maurice was only a few yards behind him. "Piggy's specs," shouted Ralph. "If the fire's out, we'll need them." So, that's pretty smart of him, right? They think the fire's out, they need to get Piggy's glasses. He stopped shouting and swayed on his feet. Piggy was only just visible, bumbling up from the beach. Ralph looked at the horizon and then up to the mountain. Was it better to fetch Piggy's glasses, or would the ship have gone? Or if they climbed on, supposing the fire was right out, and they had to watch Piggy crawling nearer and nearer, and the ship sinking under the horizon. Rebalanced on the high peak of need, agonized by indecision, Ralph cried out, "Oh God, oh God." And Simon, struggling with bushes, caught his breath. His face was twisted, and Ralph blundered on, savaged himself as the wisp of smoke moved on. The fire was dead. They saw that straight away, saw what they had known down on the beach and the smoke and home that beckoned. The fire was right out, smokelessness and dead. The watchers were gone, and a pile of unused fuel lay ready. Once Ralph turned to the sea, and the horizon stretched, the impersonal once more, barren of all but the faintest traces of smoke. And Ralph stumbled along the rocks, saved himself on the edge of the pink cliff, and screamed at the ship, "Come back, come back." He ran backwards and forwards along the cliff, his face always to the sea. His voice rose insanely. "Come back, come back." And Simon and Marisa arrived, Ralph looking at them with unwinking eyes, and Simon turned away, smearing the water from his cheeks. Ralph reached inside himself for the worst word he knew. They let the bloody fire out. He looked down the unfriendly side of the mountain. Piggy arrived out of breath and whimpering like a little one. Ralph clenched his fist and went very red. The intentness of his gaze and the bitterness of his voice pointed for him. There they are. A procession had appeared far down among the pink screes of the land near the water's edge. Some of the boys wore black caps, but otherwise they were almost naked. They lifted sticks in the air together. Whenever they came to an easy patch, they were chanting, something to do with the bundle that the errant twins carried so carefully. And Ralph picked out Jack easily, even at the distance, tall, red-haired, and inevitably leading the procession. Simon looked down now to Ralph, to Jack, and as he had looked from Ralph to the horizon, and what he saw seemed to make him afraid. Ralph said nothing more, but he waited while the procession came near. The chant was inaudible, but at that distance was still wordless. And behind Jack walked the twins, carrying a great stake on their shoulders. The gutted carcass of a pig swung from the stake, swinging heavily as the twins toiled up the uneven ground. The pig's head hung down with the gaping neck and seemed to search for something on the ground. At last, the words floated up to them across the bowl of blackened wood and ash. Kill the pig, cut her throat, and spill her blood. Yet, as the words became audible, the procession reached the steepest part of the mountain, and in a minute or two, the chant had died away. Piggy sniveled, and Simon shushed him as quickly as though he had spoken too loudly in church. Jack, his face smeared with clay, reached the top first and hailed Ralph excitedly with lifted spear. "Look, we killed a pig, we stole up on them, we got in a circle," and voices broke from the hunters. "We got in a circle, we crept up, the pig squealed, and the twins stood with the pig swinging between them, dropping black gouts on the rock. They seemed to share one wide, ecstatic grin. Jack had too many things to tell Ralph at once. Instead, he danced a step or two, then remembered his dignity and stood still, grinning. He noticed blood on his hands and grimaced distastefully, looking for something with which to clean them, then wiped them on his shorts and laughed. And Ralph spoke. "You let the fire out." Jack checked, vaguely irritated by this irrelevance, but was too happy to let it worry him. "We can light the fire again. You should have been with us, Ralph. We had a smashing time. The twins got knocked over. We hit the pig and I fell on top." "I cut the pig's throat," said Jack proudly, and yet twitched as he said it. "Can I borrow yours, Ralph, to make a nick in the hilt?" And the boys chattered and danced, and the twins continued to grin. "There was lashes of blood," said Jack, laughing and shuddering. "You should have seen it. We'll go hunting every day." And Ralph spoke again, hoarsely. He had not moved. "You let the fire out." The repetition made Jack uneasy. He looked at the twins and then back at Ralph. "We had to have them in the hunt, or there wouldn't have been enough for a ring." And he flushed, conscious of a fault. "The fire's only been out an hour or two. We can light it again." He noticed Ralph's scared nakedness and the somber silence of all four of them. He sought, charitable in his happiness, to include them in the thing that had happened. His mind was crowded with memories of the knowledge that had come to them when they were closed in on the struggling pig, knowledge that they had outwitted a living thing, imposed their will upon it, taken away its life for a long, satisfying drink. He spread his arms wide. You should have seen the blood. And the hunters were more quiet now, but at this they buzzed again. Ralph flung his hair back, one arm pointed out towards the empty horizon. His voice was loud and savage and struck them into silence. There was a ship. Jack faced at once with too many doubtful implications, ducked away from all of them. He laid a hand on his pig and drew his knife, and Ralph brought his arm down, fist clenched, and his voice shook. There was a ship out there. You said you'd keep the fire going, and you let it out. He took a step towards Jack, who turned and faced him. They might have seen us. We might have gone home. This was too bitter for Piggy, who had forgotten his timidity in the agony of his loss. He began to cry shrilly. You and your blood, Jack Merridew, you and your hunted, we might have gone home. Ralph pushed Piggy to one side. I was chief, and you were going to do what I said. You talk, but you can't even build huts. Then you go off hunting and let out the fire. He turned away, silent for a moment, and then his voice came again on a peak of a feeling. There was a ship, and one of the smaller hunters began to wail. The dismal truth was filtering through to everybody. Jack went very red as he hacked and pulled at the pig. The job was too much. We needed everybody. And Ralph turned. You could have had everybody when the shelters were finished, but you had to hunt. We needed meat. Jack stood up as he said this, and the bloody knife in his hand. The two boys faced each other, and there was a brilliant world of hunting, tactics, fierce exhilaration, skills, and there was a world of longing and baffled common sense. Jack transferred the knife to his left hand and smudged blood over his forehead as he pushed the plastered hair down. Piggy began again. You didn't ought to have let the fire out. You said you'd keep the smoke going. This from Piggy and the wails of agreement from some of the hunters drove Jack to violence. The Bolton look came into his blue eyes. He took a step and, able to at last to hit somebody, struck his fist into Piggy's stomach. Piggy sat down with a grunt, and Jack stood over him. His voice was vicious with humiliation. You would you, Fatty? And Ralph made a step forward, and Jack smacked Piggy's head. Piggy's glasses flew off and tinkered on the rocks, and Piggy cried out in terror, my specs. He went crouching forward and feeling over the rocks, but Simon, who got there first, found them for him. Passions beat about Simon on the mountaintop with awful wings. One side's broken. Piggy grabbed and put on the glasses, and he looked malevolently at Jack. I got to have them specs. Now I only got one now. Just you wait. Jack made a move towards Piggy, who scrambled away till a great rock lay between them, and he thrust his head over the top and glared at Jack through one flashing glass. Now I only got one eye. Just you wait. Jack mimicked the whine and scrambled. Just you wait, yeah. Piggy and the parody were so funny that the hunters began to laugh, and Jack felt encouraged. He went on scrambling, and the laughter rose to a gale of hysteria. Unwillingly, Ralph felt his lips twitch, and he was angry at himself for giving way. He muttered, that was a dirty trick. Jack rode out of his gyration and stood facing Ralph. His words came in a shout. All right, all right. He looked at Piggy and the hunters and Ralph. I'm sorry about the fire. I mean, he drew himself up. I apologize. So he gets pressed enough. Ralph is pretty unwavering, and eventually he does apologize. The buzz from the hunters was one of admiration at this handsome behavior. Clearly they were of the opinion that Jack had done the right thing. He had put himself in the right by his generous apology, and Ralph obscurely in the wrong. They waited for an appropriate, decent answer. Yet Ralph's throat refused to pass one. He resented, as an addition to Jack's misbehavior, his verbal trick. The fire was dead, the ship was gone. Could they not see? Anger instead of decency passed his throat. That was a dirty trick. They were silent on the mountaintop while the opaque look appeared in Jack's eyes and passed again. Ralph's final word was an ungracious mutter. All right, all right, light the fire. And with some positive action before them, a little tension died. Ralph said no more, did nothing, still looking actively down at the ashes around his feet. And Jack was loud and active. He gave up the orders, saying, whistled, threw remarks at silent Ralph, remarks that he did not need an answer, and therefore could not invite a snub, and still Ralph was silent. No one, not even Jack, would ask him to move in the end, and they had to rebuild the fire 3 yards away and in a place not as convenient. So Ralph asserted his chieftainship and could not have chosen a better way if he had thought for days. Against this weapon, so indefinable and effective, Jack was powerless, enraged without knowing why. But this time the pile was built and they were on different sides of a high barrier. When they dealt with the fire, another crisis arose. Jack had no means of lighting it. Sorry, I'm losing something here. Jack had no means of lighting it. Then, to his surprise, Ralph went to Piggy and took the glasses from him. Not even Ralph knew how a link between him and Jack had been snapped and fastened elsewhere. I'll bring him back. I'll come too. Piggy stood behind him, islanded by a sea of meaningless color, while Ralph knelt and focused on the glossy spot. Instantly, the fire was alight. Piggy held out his hand and grabbed the glasses back. Before these fantastically attractive violets, flowers of violet and red and yellow, unkindness melted away. It became a circle of boys around a campfire, and even Piggy and Ralph were drawn in. Some of the other boys were rushing down the slope for more wood, while Jack hacked at the pig. They were holding the whole carcass on the stakes of the fire, but the steak burnt more quickly than the pig roasted. In the end, they skewered bits of meat on branches and held them in the flames. And even then, almost as much boy was roasted as pig. Ralph dribbled. He meant to refuse meat, but his past diet of fruit and nuts with an odd crab or fish gave him too little resistance. He accepted a piece of half-raw meat and gnawed it like a wolf. And Piggy spoke, almost dribbling. Aren't I having none? Jack had meant to leave him in doubt as an assertion of power, but Piggy, by advertising this omission, made more cruelty necessary. You didn't hunt. No more did Ralph, said Piggy wetly, nor Simon, he amplified. There isn't more than a half-sporth of meat in a crab. Ralph stirred uneasily, and Simon, sitting between the twins and Piggy, wiped his mouth and shoved his piece of meat over the rocks to Piggy, who grabbed it. The twins giggled, and Simon lowered his face in shame. Then Jack leapt to his feet, slashed off a great hunk of meat, and flung it down at Simon's feet. Eat, damn you. He glared at Simon. Take it. He spun on his heel, centered towards a bewildered circle of boys. I got you meat. Numberless and inexpressive frustrations combined to make his rage elemental and awe-inspiring. I painted my face. I stole up. Now you eat, all of you, and I. Slowly the silence on the mountaintop deepened until the clinks of fire and the soft hissing of roasted meat could be heard clearly. Jack looked round for understanding, but found only respect. Ralph stood among the ashes of the signal fire, his hands full of meat, saying nothing. And then at last, Maurice broke the silence. He changed the subject to only one thing that could bring the majority of them together. Where did you find the pig? Ed Roger pointed down to the unfriendly side. They were there by the sea. And Jack, recovering, could not bear to have his story told. He broke in quickly. We spread round, and I crept on hands and knees. The spears fell out because they hadn't barbs on. The pig ran away and made an awful noise. It turned back and ran to the circle, bleeding. And all the boys were talking at once, relieved and excited. We closed in. The first blow had paralyzed his hindquarters, and so then the circle could close in and beat. I cut the pig's throat, and the twins, still sharing their identical grin, jumped up and ran around each other. And then the rest joined in, making pig dying noises and shouting. Give him a 4-penny one. And then Maurice pretended to be a pig, ran squealing to the center, and the hunters, circling still, pretended to beat him. And as they danced, they sang, kill the pig, cut her throat, and bash her in. Ralph watched them, envious and resentful. Not till they flagged and the chant did away did he speak. I'm calling an assembly. And one by one, they halted and stood watching him. With the conch, I'm calling a meeting, even if we have to go on to the dark, down on the platform, when I blow it now. He turned away and walked off the mountain. And so that is chapter 4. Okay. I don't know if we're gonna have one second. I don't think we're gonna have time for another one. No, we probably will not. Maybe 1 to 103. No, okay, so we won't have time for another one. I don't think anyway. So instead, we'll start with the plot summary here. Then there's some other stuff we want to go through. So starting off here, so we have chapter 4. So first off, what we see is, so we really see that Piggy is an outsider. It's directly stated. No one respects him. He's an outsider. They think he's weird. Even though he has good ideas, Piggy does have good ideas. He's not listened to. He's an outsider and he's ignored. So we also know that, so Jack goes on a hunt with everyone. And this is where we start to see a painted mask, which will have a meeting soon. In doing so, the fire burns out and a seen ship ignores them, right? Because the fire burnt out. So what ultimately ends up happening here then is we know that Jack does catch a pig, but he ends up getting, yelled at by Ralph, right? So Ralph is angry at Jack. And eventually Jack becomes humiliated, right? We've seen Jack humiliated before as well. But this time he's not trying to ease the tension, right? He's confronting it right from the start. No, like you messed up, you messed up, you messed up. You let the fire go out. So Jack becomes humiliated. He has no out. So what does he do? He ends up beating Piggy, right? He resorts to violence. And ultimately, Ralph calls a meeting.
Wait, what? Jack got humiliated and he just took it out on Piggy.
He just took it out on Piggy. Yeah. Like before, we think about the leadership, like when Ralph was made leader, when we think about that first hunt, there was always some out. Ralph tried to spare him some dignity, right? This time, like, nope, you screwed up. You got to own up.
And then his glasses got broke, right? Or something.
And his glasses did get broken. Yes. So like, if you get a second just to write that. Is everyone done? Okay, so there's a couple of things here. So we won't start filling in all the stuff, but we do, these are the themes, and these are going to really start emerging. In fact, you've probably started to see some of these emerge. We have themes of civilization versus savagery. And that's really what's coming to a front now. We have individualism versus, feeling as a community. We have a loss of innocence theme, rebuilding society, whether man's evil or good inherently. And then also like a mob mentality. So these are some of the really big themes within this. You've probably started to see some of these already. And then, this is just putting the words to that. I want to scroll down a little bit here. I'm going to start with the 6 hunts here. So there are 6 hunts throughout this. And this is where we're going to start seeing the loss of civilization, essentially. So that savagery is going to grow and civilization is going to kind of weaken as we go through this novel. And so we've already lived through 3 of these hunts here. Stuff here. So just as a quick summary here. So what we want to do is we just want to go through what happens with this and what's the actual consequences now that we're starting to see some bigger themes. So first off, in chapter 1, we see this is where Jack hesitates to kill the pig, right? But in doing so, he gets really mad and upset, and he eventually commits to doing it in the future. So this is where we see Jack prioritizes. This is where we start to see Jack prioritizing hunting over rescue. We see chapter 3. So this is when he sneaks up on them building huts and stuff. So basically, this is when we see again Jack fail. And what's he going to see? He's going to see Simon and Ralph building huts. Not only building huts, failing to build huts is a more apt description here. So he sees them in these huts, and this is when we start to see This is when we start to see Jack and Ralph's relationship strains. Because Ralph really needs help with building these huts. Jack only wants to hunt. Wouldn't it be great if we built the huts and then hunted, right? Which we saw as the consequence in chapter 4. So Jack only wants to hunt. So the consequence here is we see the relationship strain. I'm just going to highlight that. The highlighted part is the consequence, because that's what we're kind of focused on here. And then finally, chapter 4 is what we just read. We know that a couple things happen here. So Jack covers his face with paint. Right, talks about how he gets this crazy look in his eyes, right? This is when it's starting to become savage. So he covers the face with paint. He catches a pig, but burns the fire out. And the consequence here is they are not rescued. Hunting becomes more important. And finally, we start to see some leadership challenges now, right? Okay. So there's one thing, there's two things that's going to happen here. So if you guys look at the page above, you're going to see I put some kind of scales here, and in it I have put 4 characters. We have Ralph, we have Jack, and we have Piggy, and we have Simon. Black, no, purple. So we have 4 characters here, and what I'm curious is, and this is just your own opinion, like there's no real right or wrong answer here, but where do you think that they kind of are focused on with certain things? We have the fire, we have the group, there's the beast, rescue, and how do you problem solve as a society? So right now we're in we're just done chapter 4. You're going to come back to this later, but for now, I just want you to try and place each of these people in here and label it. So for example, if you think Ralph is really concerned about the signal fire, you would put like an R here, for example, or you could color code it or something. Just put where you think each of these 4 characters are on all 5 of these issues, and we're going to visit this back later. So if you think Ralph is
a 5, he's so concerned about it. But if you think Jack is not concerned at all, you know, he would go here. Maybe Ralph's or Simon's somewhere in the middle, etc. So before we start that, so I'll have you guys do that. We will come and look at our answers later, probably Wednesday or something. The other one is just these questions up here. I'll give you guys some time to do there, not a whole lot. If you're unsure about something, please ask. For the sake of time, we will probably not be going over any or many of these. So if you're confused about something, please ask. If you get stuck on something, it's fine to go past it. We're just trying to get some information down right now. So I'll give you guys 20 minutes to do that. Do this character placement map and then just work on some of those questions there, and we'll come back tomorrow.